Hello, welcome to our webinar on Innovating with Purpose, Social Impact and Technology. I'm Suzanne Angell and I head up the public sector team here at ScotLogic, and I'm joined by Technology Director Ollie and special guest Ishmael from DWP. I'll let them themselves. Ollie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, Oliver Cronk, or Ollie, Technology Director at ScotLogic. I lead a lot on our research and development, but in particular lead on our sustainable technology practice, and we'll get into some of the exciting things we've been doing on that as part of this conversation. So yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks.
Yeah, Ishmael Burdeau. I work for DWP, Department for Work and Pensions. If you don't know the DWP, we have around 20 million users, and at some point, I expect everyone on this call will be a user of DWP, because at some point you'll probably be born or hopefully reach pension age or something. So we touch everybody at some point. And I'm the digital sustainability lead, a very small team, and we're trying to just elevate the profile of digital sustainability and all the work we do.
Cool, thank you very much. So I know the two of you know each other very well because you work together and have done for some time as members of the Government Digital Sustainability Alliance, or the GDSA. Ishmael, could you tell us a bit about the GDSA and your role in it representing the Department of Work and Pensions?
Yeah, sure. So the GDSA, I believe, started about a year and a half ago. And initially it was something for basically the big technology companies, so Microsoft, BT, Vodafone, et cetera, to try and align how they were delivering technology to be more sustainable. And over time, it's evolved into something much bigger that includes smaller companies like ScotLogic, for example, British companies, but also government departments. And so we've come up with a set of working groups looking at different areas of impact. So there's a planetary impacts working group. There's the circular economy working group. We've got a couple of other working groups. You can look online and find out what they're up to. And it's now become more of a collaborative thing between government and the private sector to sort of elevate the profile of sustainability, come up with best practice, methodologies. So there's various, like I said, there's measurements, a big thing, procurement's another thing, and the sort of eco-design is another area. So I guess those are the main three areas.
So, Ollie, I know you sit in a number of different working groups. What are your particular interests in the GDSA?
Yeah, so I have been heavily involved in planetary impacts. We recently did a workshop actually in London, and we kind of replanned for this year. And so I've also been involved in the AI one, and so now I'm taking quite a sort of leading role, supporting James Blackshaw, who is actually the chair for the AI working group. And yeah, that's sustainability across a bunch of different dimensions. I mean, there is quite a focus on the environmental aspect, but we're also looking at the societal impacts and governance sort of aspects as well, at how, what are the best practices or the recommendations for government departments around using AI in a responsible, sustainable way. Now, of course, that's everything from the energy consumption of AI models, both in their training and in their operations, but it's also thinking about the risks and the challenges around the deployment of those technologies within the departments from a sustainability standpoint. So yeah, no, it's fascinating. I mean, I really enjoy it because you get to work with peers across the private sector. As Ishmael said, there's the likes of Microsoft and BT, but there's also other smaller consultancies like ourselves, and it's generally the people at those companies that are really passionate about technology sustainability, working with departments like DEFRA and DWP and Treasury and so on and so forth. And particularly the Crown Commercial Service is an interesting angle as well, because a lot of what we're talking about is how do we help government sort of procure better. So how do we create a feedback loop, I suppose, between the suppliers to government in the tech space and the government putting requirements on sustainable procurement and so on. So it's a really useful sort of opportunity to have conversations that you wouldn't otherwise better have, because as you well know, Suzanne, kind of public sector procurement is obviously quite structured and formal. So this provides far more of a sort of opportunity to workshop and sort of explore new ways, new approaches, new standards, new recommendations, new frameworks, etc., to kind of improve things. And of course, our tech carbon standard has come up quite a bit. I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that later.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things is a sort of somebody who sells into the public sector, I'm well used to the fact, for those of you who don't know, quite often 10% of the marks on a public sector bid are for affecting our social value impact. And quite often customers ask about environment, and I go back to Ollie and say, like, can I really understand what does good look like here? So if I got a tender out from DWP, what is it they're looking for around a supplier about how we might offer more sustainable solutions around digital services. Ishmael, any thoughts on that when you're looking at suppliers coming to DWP? What is it you're looking for from an environmental perspective?
Well, there was a time about 10 years ago when I was sort of in your shoes. I was working for in the private sector, and we would apply, put in ITTs or respond ITTs for public sector work. And one thing that I think is important in that is consistency. So if you're bidding for work with two different departments, there's a common set of standards and things. And that's what's been missing up to now, is every department's interpreted the rules around social value differently. And with GDSA, we're trying to say, no, these are how we commonly should measure things. And this is the methodology you should use. If you can't use it, use maybe a slightly less precise one. And I think that's where we've got a real opportunity for these suppliers to move into much more sustainable ways of delivering stuff. So in terms of, the way that social value has been done in the past is not always, I think there's a couple of problems. One is that the tech sector is very good at hiding behind cloaks of, renewable energy promises and things like that. So, which most people aren't really equipped to question. And the other side is that from our side, we don't have the skills in our teams, isn't the knowledge to read through some of the claims and so forth. So we're trying to equip our sustainability or our procurement people to understand sustainability in the contracts, but also make the rules very clear so the suppliers can write things that are much more meaningful. Than we've literally had ITTs where they talk about having a team day out to go for a walk in the park, or planting trees is the cliched one, but it's often about, or they'll say that our services have no emissions because they're in the cloud. And there's that level of poor, responses. And so, but there could be people who are less knowledgeable than my team who might read that and think, oh, take it at face value. So there's a lot of knowledge needed from our side to interpret what the suppliers are claiming.
Interesting. So I'll move on because actually one of the things there about measurability, and I know that Ollie's been working for some time on the tech carbon standard, and the standard's now been included in the service manual. So for those of you who don't know what the service manual is, effectively it's a manual that provides guidance to public sector teams on how to create and run really great public sector services. So Ollie, can you talk a bit more about the tech carbon standard from a measurement perspective? How does it help not just supplier teams, but effectively the blended teams, the customer teams, and delivering effectively identify and reduce emissions?
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. So we created Tech Carbon Standard because we spotted a gap really in, there was lots of high level advice for sort of CTOs, and there's the GHG protocol, right? So the greenhouse gas protocol, which tells you at quite a high level when it comes to carbon emissions, what kind of categories your activities as a business fall under. The problem is the greenhouse gas protocol doesn't really work very well when it comes to tech, because a lot of technology falls under what's known as scope 3, which is your purchase sort of goods and services category. And so when we were looking at sort of what exists out there to sort of help organizations navigate and for technology teams to have sensible conversations with their sustainability counterparts, there was a real sort of lack. There were some amazing projects at quite a low level. So there was things like the Cloud Carbon Footprint tool and various other things that help you measure, code changes and things like that. Great little sort of grassroots projects that are quite techy and at a low level. But there was a real void of things in between the two. So what we did was we spent quite a lot of time thinking about how do we map this out. And so the Tech Carbon Standard is born out of this need to create a consistent framework that helps people understand it's more than just electricity consumption. So to Ishmael's point, and I think you were sort of laughing a little bit about this as well, that like it's more than just the electricity that your cloud provider uses or the servers that that run your compute. That's one of the three categories of the Tech Carbon Standard, which is the operational one. So in the middle of the Tech Carbon Standard, you have operational emissions. And that generally breaks down into the things that people tend to measure, which is things like, your kind of electricity. So how much electricity are you using to kind of power your servers or your laptops or other bits of technology equipment? And then, what services are you buying? So things like cloud services or managed services. That all sits in that operational bracket. And that's often what people think of when they think about making tech sustainable. They think about, well, as long as those things are powered by renewable energy, and if my supplier is telling me they are, then we're done. The reality is, unfortunately, some of that is done for sort of accounting purposes, that they'll say, oh yeah, we've bought renewable credits, but the reality is the grid isn't 100% renewable. In the UK, it's perhaps about 60% or thereabouts on average throughout the year. So the reality is you're not always running on renewable energy. And then the other part of the equation is it's not all about the operational power consumption. It's also about upstream, which is the first category of the Tech Carbon Standard, and downstream as well. So let me talk a little bit about what upstream is. So upstream is essentially your purchase products. So if you buy laptops, servers, you buy desktops, monitors, TVs, any kind of electronic devices, those things have a life cycle impact. When those devices are created, manufactured, there's the kind of mining for the materials, there's the production of those devices, there's then the packaging and shipping of those devices to you as a customer, and then there's the disposal of those devices as well. Those things often just get ignored. They get kind of not thought about because they're out of mind. An awful lot of our e-waste gets shipped abroad. We don't see how it gets processed or managed. So that upstream category is really, really important and can account for quite a bit of an estate. Downstream is ultimately, what are your digital products and services doing on someone else's device? So if you're running an app or a website or some sort of online service, those things consume resources on people's hardware, their laptops, their phones, and so on. So how you create those and optimize those, or don't optimize those, has an impact on the energy consumption or the need for someone to, say, upgrade their device. So if you put out a service that's really, really inefficient, someone might go, well, I'm going to need to buy a new laptop or a new phone to run this app because it's, my current one isn't performant. So there are real implications as well about that downstream impact that organizations have. So a question about measuring and mitigating. The first step, the classic line is you can't manage what you can't measure, right? So this framework isn't just sort of, a structure, a taxonomy, a framework. It's also got recommendations of what you should be capturing, whether that's kilowatt hours of electricity, whether that's sort of cloud consumption, whether that's kilograms of e-waste, or hardware consumed, different products. So there are ways of measuring, and then ultimately, once you've got things being measured, you can start to kind of look at how you optimize those and reduce those numbers. I mean, a practical step that many organizations do to start with is go, where am I running my infrastructure? Can I run it somewhere that's lower carbon? So most people don't realize that cloud providers often default to quite a dirty US zone by default. You can go in and quickly switch that, and that's a relatively quick win. And there are other things you can do around your hardware, like expanding the lifespan and so on and so forth. But I'll stop there because I'm conscious I've rabbited on already quite a bit.
Well, the bit that interests me, it is really difficult. And I think for Ishmael, you talked about there being 20 million users of DWP. Mm-hmm. There are massive technology teams, and there's work going on all the time building the services that help millions of people access the help, advice, financial support they need. How does DWP factor that environmental aspect into the decision making about what services to build, how to do it, the technology choices?
Yeah, we're at the start of this journey, and it is extremely complicated. Not so much from the technology side, it's often from the policy side. So when we look at the way we deliver services, one of the easy things to focus on at the beginning is how can we reduce some of so the Technology Carbon Standard looks at your digital footprint, but a lot of the service we deliver have a much wider footprint. So there's customer travel, there's staff travel, there's print and paper, there's phone calls, video calls, all this sort of junk that the people have to do to get the support they need. And that's sometimes driven by sort of policy or just basically inertia, because we've been doing these things for many years. That's the way we've always done it. And so there needs to be a shift in mindset. We want to digitize things. And so in digitize, we need to measure what the previous thing looked like, the paper-based one, but also be mindful that the new electronic one isn't going to be worse than the digital one. And there are cases I've seen where we've over-provisioned cloud technology and actually used more CO2 than we would have used using paper. The other thing to think about when doing it is we often, so if somebody has a disability, for example, they may apply for that when they're 16 or 18 or something, and they may live until 70 or 80. So we will store that customer record for 50, 60 years. And the footprint of that data, we don't really think about. And some work we did with Scott Logic on the Carbon Hack 24, we wanted to measure how, if I store a gigabyte of data in the cloud for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, what's the footprint of that? So we're using the Technology Carbon Standard to sort of conceptualize the digital side of it, and it helps people like architects and engineers who don't want to care about scope 2, scope 3. They just want to know, what's my digital service? They can see the the map of the different components, and it's very recognizable. So we're using that to sort of help the digital teams understand their footprint, but we're also going wider, like I said, to look at how do we convert from a paper-based or hybrid side of thing to a fully digital, and doing it mindfully, so we're not consuming excess resources in that digitization bit.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm just trying to think. So one of the things, I mean, we were chatting before we joined this call about sort of sustainability bound, but not buying new things. And there is a link there between, actually, if you're building good services that work on old kit, from an accessibility perspective, it's really important in DWP that the services are accessible to all those people who need it. Again, so what we don't want to build are services that actually need new shiny equipment to run on. And although I would tend to think about it, and my job is be something that I'm thinking about from an accessibility perspective, actually accessibility and sustainability go hand in hand.
Well, we're very fortunate in the UK to have the Gov UK design system, which is a very, generally speaking, if it's applied properly, is a very accessible, very lean front end. And I think that's where on a sustainability point of view, that's where potentially a problem, because there's no graphics, there's no video, it's very clean and simple design, accessible, lightweight pages, which is fantastic. But that, if you just look at the normal carbon estimators, you'll go away thinking that you've done all the work there is needed to do, because your web page is lightweight. And so we need to unpack that and look underneath and look at things like storage, use of AI, use of cloud, use of legacy technologies. The other thing, we have many of our systems date back to the 90s and 80s, even older, and we haven't managed to move all of them into modern services. So we're also carrying this extra weight of legacy technology, and if we're going to be modernizing, that burden's still there. And so if we look at the Tech Carbon Standard, something like that, you'd say, well, to deliver the service is going to need this mainframe legacy system in a data center somewhere, plus the new cloud things. So part of the work I'm doing is trying to get people to think about modernizing means switching off the legacy. We can't just keep adding. We need to be turning old things off. So a lot of it's focused internally rather than what the customer sees on the front end. It's more the back end stuff.
I mean, I like the fact that you've talked about sort of some of the broader aspects of sustainability there, because I think, yes, we talk a lot about carbon, and of course, Tech Carbon Standard has carbon in the title. But when we look at tech sustainability, we think about the longevity of the tech, like the kind of access to skills, the kind of risk management. I think a lot of people see sustainability as potentially this sort of burden or this sort of extra thing they're going to do. I think actually you get this right. It's actually how you run things leaner, more cost effectively, in a more secure way, in a more risk managed way. Sustainability doesn't have to be at odds with running services, in a sort of effective way. So, yeah, I mean, there's a great example of security, right, which I wanted to quickly share, which is often if you make things more secure, more sustainable, you can make them more secure. So there's an interesting relationship between, in your point, Ishmael, about complexity. Often we get a little bit attracted by, magpie syndrome. We kind of want to bolt loads of things on, right? We want to make things sophisticated because as technologists often we're excited by the new and the shiny. The trouble with that is you can end up with a platform that's far more complicated than it needs to be. Classic example of this is content management systems, right? Everyone wants a content management system, but then you look at it and go, but do you really need, to build the pages every time someone hits the site? Because by doing that, you have to hit a database and various other components of your architecture. Actually, what's far better is to kind of have more of a compiled, cached website that's far simpler and actually has the security attack surface as well. So there are, when you look at it, the more and more we've looked at it, I'm not saying all the time these things are nicely aligned, but in a lot of cases, actually, there's some great alignment between security and sustainability, as well as, like you say, kind of legacy rejuvenation and retirement. There's sort of, I think sometimes it provides that extra lever that you just need to get a project over the line to kind of do things perhaps more boldly than just go, do you know what, we'll incrementally slightly improve. No, actually, from a sustainability standpoint, sometimes we've got to take some hard decisions and actually move us forward.
Yeah, from a supportability perspective, I mean, often one of the things we're looking at, particularly when we go to work with government departments, is actually the role of a supplier like Scott do, because it's temporary. And actually, most departments now have a strategy around, we're building our own teams, we're building our own skills. And actually, when we're building things, we need to build services that are well structured, well architected, and simple to enable us to clearly document them and hand them over. So it's I guess it's back to the discussion we were having before we joined the call, is everything is interlinked. It's reusing tech, its simple service, its accessibility. It isn't just the lens on the carbon standard. It's taking a bigger picture view on how it fits together. And it's supportable, maintainable, low carbon impact, accessible by using different environments.
I guess I've got a question for you guys at Scott Logic. We're starting to see in a few places the measurement of other things beyond carbon. Water is an obvious one that people talk about quite a lot, but then you're seeing some of the stuff coming out of Hugging Face and some of the stuff coming out of Green IT in France, looking at other resource use and so forth. I feel that's an important tool that people need to use to understand the impacts of digital, because focusing on carbon is sort of where we are now, but looking forward 3, 4, 5 years, where do you think you guys want to be on measuring other impacts?
Totally agree. And when the tech carbon standard got referenced in the Building Greener Services Gov UK website, I actually sort of put out a bit of a plan, a bit of a roadmap for tech carbon standard. And what we didn't want to do, we were very aware that when we did tech carbon standard, we were possibly in danger of having carbon tunnel vision, which for those of you who've not seen is this sort of thing where you just fixate on carbon and you forget things like biodiversity and other nature impacts and so on and so forth. We absolutely didn't want to do that, but we had to start the scope somewhere. We couldn't boil the ocean, so we needed to kind of manage our scope. But we're now at a point where we would really like to start working with clients on the water impact, the e-waste impact, the nature impact. So yeah, this year we'd like to add at least one of those. We'd like to add water. And if nothing else, we think that the tech carbon standard framework, if you take some of the carbon labels off of it, you could actually create like a canvas, like a tech impacts canvas that you could use as a workshop tool for projects. So that's definitely one of the things we'll be doing this year, is making a canvas version of the thing available for workshops. So teams can go, right, let's look at this project or this part of our systems landscape or project we're going to embark on. And what are the kind of upstream operational and downstream impacts from it doesn't even have to just be environmental. It could be a social thing. So it could be an AI project and you're worried about what's the societal impacts of launching this technology downstream to our end user population. So that's certainly something we're committed to do. Depending on what client work we work on with Tech Carbon Standard, I hope to do more to, like say, evolve it into other areas. We've been working with one private sector client who are really big on circularity. So they're really keen to see us add the kind of e-waste angle to this. Before we do any of this, our biggest priority though is to create a data format. So a protocol that goes along the Tech Carbon Standard categories, because the conversation we have the most with clients, private or public sector, is we need a standard way of transmitting information from suppliers to customers and from data centers to sort of SaaS providers. We need a common approach to sort of share this data. So we're going to make some attempts this year to start working on that. We're going to work with Mark Butcher and others on GDSA to kind of create something that mirrors some of the Tech Carbon Standard sort of taxonomy, but provides a concrete way of reporting, whether that's sort of kilowatt hours, whether that's CO2, whether that's some of those other metrics. So that's definitely something we're doing. In fact, we've already started working on that. So expect to see some of that. But yeah, over the next few years, I agree, Ishmael. I think that particularly in the UK, as the grid decarbonizes, we're already on a really good pathway there. As the grid decarbonizes, then operational carbon emissions should hopefully reduce. And so, yeah, you're right. We should start looking at what are those broader impacts that we need to start focusing on next.
I've got a I'm going to wait till the end on the questions. Got it. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say that, so I do a lot of my reading and learning comes from looking at what's been happening in France. And France has a very low carbon grid because of nuclear energy. Yeah. And you can see the French mindset is very much focused on materiality. The hardware, the recycling, the e-waste, all these things are much more front of mind. And the other thing I think is that when I'm talking to people and trying to engage them on sustainability, things that are much more tangible, like water, for example, affects people emotionally much more than carbon feels very abstract. And if it becomes something like biodiversity, then people often get quite emotional about that. That resonates with people much more deeply than 5 kilograms of carbon. Oh no, you've actually killed this many species or birds or whatever. It's a much more impactful thing, at least for the people building designing the services as opposed to the people buying them.
So noting, so we talked earlier about sort of reporting, and we're on that theme. I think moving on to sustainability reporting, I think Ollie, so in response to a FinTech Scotland Innovation Challenge on shaping the future of ESG and financial services, you created InferSG, and that's a tool that uses generative AI to really look at greenwashing in sustainability reports. So effectively for an analyst, or if you're Ishmael looking effectively at a supplier coming into DWP, it helps us understand effectively is understand the materiality of the report. So Ollie, tell us a bit about the problem you set out to solve, and how, in particular, the bit I'm interested in is how do you get the AI to actually produce sensible answers that are precise and reliable?
Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious we don't have a huge amount of time, and so what I had hoped we could do is share it, but I appreciate that'll have to be a follow-on video that people can go and watch. But yeah, so essentially, and I shouldn't take all the credit for this because an amazing team from ScotLogic and also our industry partner Aberdeen and also FinTech Scotland, so University of Strathclyde were really, really helpful. So yeah, we responded to the FinTech Scotland challenge, which was essentially, how can you use emerging technologies to help ESG analysts spot greenwashing? And so yeah, as you say, what we've done is we've built a system that uses a blend of generative AI and other data technologies to take the sustainability report and really scrutinize it. And we think we've taken several days of analysis work out of the essentially process. Yes, it's pretty energy intensive, and I'm sure Ishmael will challenge you on that in a minute, rightfully so. And it's still quite experimental, so it's not as efficient as it could be. But over the 3-month research period that we had, we essentially built something. And to your question about how do we make it reliable and robust, we didn't just rely on AI, right? It's a blend of using AI when it's really what it's really good for, which is sort of taking, if you put good input material into it and you ask it specific questions to summarize or kind of describe, that's what we were doing. We were essentially processing that sustainability report, looking for the key claims that are made on the environment, key claims that are made on social, key claims that are made on governance, and then sort of look for missing data that supports those, look for missing roadmaps, look for things that look suspicious, not make any decisions, but flag things to a human analyst to then decide. And then we've touched on materiality just earlier in the conversation. And for those that don't know, that's essentially what is a material issue for a given sector. And so one of the other bits of the technology we built was essentially a catalog or a curated library, if you like, of documents like the nature impacts, the biodiversity impacts, the water impacts for different sectors, and reports from sustainability professionals that are available on open internet that give you an idea of what the material issues are for different sectors. So what InferESG is able to do is not just call out greenwashing, but also call out green hushing as well. And what green hushing is essentially where a sustainability report sort of tries to do misdirection, right? Talks about all the good things that they might be doing in one space, but then doesn't talk about the material issues that they should actually be working on. So we also have a section that talks about the material issues for that organization and looks at the coverage for those material issues in the report and highlights where there perhaps might be gaps or issues that might look like there are areas that aren't being covered. So yeah, I mean, we were a little bit skeptical initially of can AI do this, and it's not just AI on its own. It is a blend of things like knowledge graphs and other technologies. But yeah, we've been really pleased with the sort of accuracy and precision to the point where it's still alpha and beta. The code's available on GitHub. We can send the links in the case study. But yeah, it's ultimately a great example of where you use these AI tools for something very specific and you wrap them with very clear instructions, then you get decent results. Still not perfect, but you get pretty decent results that then a human can review and evaluate the effectiveness of what's in front of them. It's certainly not going to blindly replace an ESG analyst, but to kind of help accelerate the workflow and take potentially days, if not weeks, out of sort of researching companies' claims. We think it's pretty powerful.
So one of the themes that comes out of that is around sort of AI, and we've talked about sort of using AI to detect greenwashing. We can't have a seminar talking about sustainability without talking about resource consumption around AI. Clearly, throwing things into large language models to ask it sort of fairly trivial questions. Ishmael, what are your thoughts on sort of resource consumption of AI, and what can we do as technologists to use AI in a more environmentally responsible way?
I mean, I'm more concerned about the wider impacts of AI, what behaviors it drives in our society, than the direct impacts. Those are important, but I've been looking at, say, the work of Will Alpine in the US, who's the former Microsoft sustainability lead, and he talks about enabled emissions. So if you're using AI to frack more or gas and oil, or increase your sales figures for an oil company, that's going to be more impactful than DWP using AI to evaluate somebody's benefit claim or something like that. So that's the more worrying side of it. In terms of direct consumption, what I'd be worried about is sort of the thoughtless or lazy use of AI, where we're just basically offloading our cognitive skills to some AI system, which is centralized and using a lot of resource for it. I know Oliver's talked a lot, I've listened to some of his stuff, very good on sort of edge compute and things like that. Smaller models, all these things are definitely one of the ways forward. That could lead to rebound effects and just lead to more consumption, and it all just gets wiped out through that. But there is definitely work going on there that's good. I mean, I'm also, one of the things I'm trying to get people engaged in my area is combining some of the social issues we're trying to solve with the environmental issues we're facing. And an example that's an AI one, which I think is really interesting, and I'll just plug this company because I think they're doing something super interesting, is Ahita. They're basically edge AI, where they move the servers to your actual house, and they strap a server basically onto your water heater, and it runs the machine learning models in your house, and that heats your water. And that, if you think about fuel poverty in this country, is a huge issue. Energy prices are extortionate, and we're wasting so much heat from these computers. We could use that heat in the district heating in swimming pools feels a bit less valuable to me than actually providing it to people in need.
Yeah, there was a stat last week. So I wrote my latest piece actually was on the conference Data Center World last week, and there was a stat that said 10% of Europe's energy needs could be met through data centers, which seems quite wild. But then I was also speaking to Mark Bjornesgaard of Deep Green, and he said something like over 95% of the electricity that goes into data centers is actually heat. They're essentially massive furnaces, and the fact we're not looking at data centers as an opportunity to kind of reuse that heat is a real shame. It's going to be hard, of course, to rip up roads.
Well, I think we need to move away from the idea of data centers. Why do we need a data center? Yeah. We need data, which is now to be in the center somewhere. And we have enough like in talking to Hita, they say, well, you can move data around very easily. Latency isn't a problem for most of the stuff we're doing. We're on this call now. There's no problem with latency. I'm down in Sheffield, you're up in wherever you are, in London or something. It's all working fine.
Yeah.
But heat is very difficult to move. And so if you have a data center, it's typically built out of town, how do you move that heat to where it's needed?
Yeah.
It's much more effective to move the data to where the people are than,
and to move the data to where the power is, right? So where there's renewable energy that's not being used, where we've got wind power that's being curtailed, why aren't we using that to sort of train models? I mean, I put out.
The problem is obviously it's the business models we have around data centers.
Yes.
There's a huge amount of profit, concrete, steel, security guards, numbers of servers packed into a room. That's a clear profitable model that maybe there's pushback there.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll always need data center for some workloads. Like currently training some of these AI models, it is far faster if you have that sort of in a high bandwidth kind of situation. But you're right, inference, running models. There's no reason why that couldn't be pushed out, and that's a lot of what I talk about in the piece. There's more than one way to architect AI that I put out recently, and I think we're sitting on. If you look at all the gaming consoles we have in the UK and gaming computers that. Perhaps if you're not 24/7 gamer, there are probably a fair amount of hours in the night or the day when you're at work when that computer isn't being used, and it could potentially be used for sovereign AI in the UK. And this is something that I've certainly been talking about in the GDSA AI meetings. So I guess the trouble with some of the stuff is it's not always well received by some people in the tech community, because of course the tech industry is built around a lot of this hyperscale concentration and so on and so forth. And of course we work quite a bit with cloud providers. So I think there is a place for cloud, but there's probably also a place for more innovative thinking about where does this compute come from? Where does this infrastructure come from that we need for AI? Well, it doesn't necessarily have to come from big centralized data centers, like you say, Ishmael. That can be creative repurposing.
We've always thought of energy as a power station, a nuclear power station, or a gas or coal-fired power station, massive big building pumping out energy. I think you have solar panels as well in your house. I have solar panels. Distributing energy where it's needed, putting a battery in your house, using your electric vehicle as a battery. There's lots of creative ways we can rethink smaller scale. I just worry that the business models we have around technology don't really fit with this open source distributed local model. It's all about centralization and constant upgrades and things.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions that come into relevance. So I'm going to open the floor to any questions anyone might have. And if you do have them, pop them in the chat on the right-hand side. The team will share them with us. And you can see they've also shared some resources around the TCS and the sustainability work. But a question has come in already. They approved it. A question has come in that I thought was particularly relevant. So we were talking about big tech. What are your views on how open source software can help in accelerating innovation, standardizing tools while keeping costs down, especially in the whole area of ESG analytics and data reporting?
So I'll perhaps start on this one. I think we've already touched on some of this, right? I think the open source movement is incredible for sort of galvanizing grassroots action on issues. And the reason we've open sourced the Tech Carbon Standard and Inver ESG is we passionately believe these issues are bigger than just us, and actually we can have a greater impact if we open source them. I think you can see also what's happening in China and in France with their AI models that they're open sourcing. It's that open innovation sort of drives people to really understand and build on top of each other's work. And the transparency from an ESG perspective, I think, is critical, because if anyone is making claims about, a carbon calculation or a water usage calculation or anything like that, you need to be able to go and demand to see how that calculation has been arrived at. Because if people are using their own methodologies, well, perhaps they're fudging numbers. So this is why I think the open source community is really, really important to the whole ESG space, because I think it's needed for transparency and sharing and building on top of each other's work, because it's a public good thing, right? It's something in all our interests. So we should sort of contribute that to the commons and build on it collectively.
I have nothing to add. Oliver said it. Yeah, exactly. You put it in really well there. It's essential for this transparency and openness around anything to do with ESG.
Thank you. Right, I think the next one, I'm trying to think, how do I get the flow? So the next question I'm going to go with, I'm going to press the display button, is what advice would you give to a business case? What would you give advice would you give to somebody making a business case for financing a sustainable tech project?
Ishmael, do you want to go for that one?
Yeah, go with this one. Yeah, so I guess one of the problems in the whole sustainability area, it's become very politicized unnecessarily. And there's a perception among many people that somehow it's going to add cost, and depending what you're doing, it could add cost. So if you're talking about converting your house to a air source heat pump, there will be a cost involved. If you're talking about switching off more of your tech, doing more with less, making things last longer, there's going to be huge financial savings. And we know from the work we've done, the research we've looked at, that a very high percentage of cloud compute is not ever used. It's paid for but not used. So we're looking at between 25 and 60% over provisioning of technology. So there's a clear financial case for doing it. And I think we're seeing at the moment huge geopolitical things going on, which I won't go into too much. It's not very pleasant. But my view is the UK is in a leading position, potentially leading position, as an English-speaking country, with a good technology sector, to be a few steps ahead of the rest of the world that might catch up in, when is the next election, 2020, whatever it is. I won't go into that one. But if we get a different geopolitics in 4 years' time, the appetite for this may all change. At the moment, it's all being turned off, but the climate crisis is not going away. The shortage of resources is not going away.
Yeah, and I guess to add to this, I think that if the case for the project isn't blindingly obvious from a financial standpoint, you need to go and look at it and have another go. Because Mark Butcher's really good on this one as well. I mean, he presents when he talks about this topic. He says actually you can motivate people to find financial savings by coupling it to sustainability. Because if you ask people to go and save money, yeah, they might save you a bit of money. But if you ask them to go and save the planet and save money, they're generally a bit more motivated to go and do that, because there's an additional reason to do it. So actually, in a lot of cases, this just makes financial sense, full stop. Now, there are things you need to invest in. There are perhaps more expensive choices, like it might be more expensive to host something in an area with different energy sources than perhaps cheap, dirty ones. But in the round, yeah, as Ishmael says, in general, you're able to sort of save a lot of money and put your company on a more sustainable, longer term pathway, right?
Yeah, I got a question on the hosting side, actually, because I would have thought that the green energy is free or very, very cheap in most cases. I would have imagined if hosting costs are higher, it might be because of the local labor force. Other costs, like running it in Switzerland versus India, would be.
Yeah, I think we've got a
example.
bit of a weird thing going on at the moment where, because everyone wants, well, a lot of people want to power their stuff with renewables, the cost actually of renewables is slightly out of skew with what it should be. I think when grids go completely green, you're right, it will be lower cost, but it's a bit like how we've got the marginal pricing for our. So it's just, I think because of carbon credits and so on. But I also think, at the moment, if you look at the parts of Europe that are the most sustainable, it's France and it's Scandinavia, and they're perhaps not always the cheapest places to host your workloads versus,
for lots of reasons. Yeah, not just energy.
Yeah.
I know that in Texas they're using solar energy to power the oil drilling, so it's free.
It's a bit of an irony there, isn't there? But,
Yeah, I mean, I guess the challenge is often that a sustainable project effectively requires a bigger upfront investment, and there'll be a financial payback. But
there's an investment in people. I think you need to invest in the people. That will be the main investment, and some of the tooling perhaps. But if it's open source, there shouldn't be a cost for that.
Cool, thanks very much. Right, I've got one that actually came up early in the chat that I was actually fascinated on, and we were talking about data. So the question is how do you balance building an inclusive, accessible front end that supports different user needs? For example, visual to visual learners, alternative to those visual permits against sustainability impacts. Now, I don't know if you've got the answers. Do we have any data to support those decisions?
So if you're just talking about HTML and a web page, I don't see there's any trade-off whatsoever. A lot of people do learn better through things like video and audio, and we know there's going to be a bigger environmental cost for a video than there would be for a page of text. So I guess you would need to look at your user audience and how you're trying to communicate your message for those types of things. And I think it would be about defaulting to a sustainable design and offering the other alternative version, the video version, for example. I can't see any problem with visuals. In fact, dark mode, for example, would be less energy consumptive than standard white on black on white.
Yeah, and I was thinking the same thing. Again, it's looking at the benefits you get from effective sustainability. So actually, as if you don't have effective front end that supports a range of communities, and actually they can't interact with the service, they're going to get in the car and drive to the job centre, or they're going to pick up the phone, or they're going to write a letter. So actually, for me, it'd be that trade-off balance. If you're saying the environmental impact of the physical solution isn't that big a difference, yes, we need multiple. But actually, if you look at how do you then deal with the failure demand, that's where, back to the business case question, it starts to rack up effectively things that might cost more and effectively have a bigger environmental impact.
Yeah, I mean, to me, an accessible front end would include lots of video, lots of images, maybe a JavaScript framework that requires a lot of client-side processing. Those are all not very sustainable choices. Sustainable choice is a simple page of information.
But it's point towards that one first, but have the other options to go and get people to go and look at.
Yeah, I mean, I can see potential cases for learning where people who don't have poor reading skills or just learn better through listening or through watching things. Video is much better. There's no question there. But that's one of the few use cases, I think, where there's an accessibility trade-off. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Oliver.
No, I think it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because it's pretty nuanced. Because I agree with your point about video perhaps being better for learning in some situations. But I think what slightly irritates me is everyone seems to feel like for websites everything needs to be switched on by default. Actually, you could start with something that still looks good, but potentially loads things on demand rather than sort of forcing you to watch the video and things like that. It's there feels like more options need to be presented to users, which would be sustainable and I think more accessible, because then you can make the choice.
Yeah, like autoplay on video is not accessible.
No.
But sites do it all the time.
Yeah. So
right.
Sorry, go on, Suzanne.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to wrap you up, guys, because we are going to time out. So I just want to say thank you to Ollie, thank you to Ishmael for your insight. Thank you to everybody who joined us. Thanks to those who asked questions. We will share the recording in coming days. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Suzanne.
Bye. Bye.